The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens of Windsor Castle. Charles stood at the large window of his private study, watching as gardeners tended to the roses that Camilla had personally selected years ago. Each bloom reminded him of promises made and dreams shared. But lately, those same flowers seemed to mock the growing distance between him and his wife. "Your Majesty, the Duchess of Cambridge has arrived for the charity meeting," his private secretary announced from the doorway. Charles turned from the window, straightening his tie. Catherine had been coming to these meetings for months now, bringing fresh ideas and genuine passion to causes that had grown stale under years of traditional royal protocol. Her presence had become the highlight of his increasingly mundane schedule. When Catherine entered the study, she carried with her the same warmth that had captivated the British public. Her smile was genuine, not the practiced expression that most royals perfected over years of public appearances. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow managed to look both elegant and approachable. "Good morning, Charles," she said, using the informal address he had encouraged during their private meetings. "I've brought the proposals for the Children's Mental Health Initiative." As they sat across from each other at the mahogany table, Charles found himself drawn to her enthusiasm. Catherine spread out charts and photographs, her voice animated as she described visiting schools in underprivileged areas. "The children there," she said, her eyes lighting up. "They just need someone to believe in them. One little girl told me she dreams of becoming a teacher, but she's never had anyone tell her it's possible." Charles leaned forward, genuinely interested. When had he last felt this engaged in royal duties? Camilla's approach to charity work was dutiful, but distant. She attended events, posed for photographs, and fulfilled obligations. Catherine threw herself into causes with her whole heart. "We could establish reading programs," Catherine continued, pointing to her notes. "Not just formal education, but storytelling sessions where children can express themselves freely." "That's brilliant," Charles said, and meant it. "Have you discussed this with William?" A shadow crossed Catherine's face briefly. "William is supportive, of course, but he's been distant lately. The pressures of his own responsibilities, I suppose." Charles nodded, understanding more than she knew. The weight of royal duty could crush the spirit if one wasn't careful. He had felt it himself, especially in recent months, as his relationship with Camilla had grown increasingly formal and cold. Their meeting stretched longer than planned. They discussed everything from environmental conservation to supporting veterans. Catherine's perspective was fresh, unencumbered by decades of royal tradition. She asked questions that challenged old ways of thinking. "Why do we always announce charitable visits in advance?" she wondered aloud. "Wouldn't surprise visits give us a better sense of reality?" Charles laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "The security team would have heart attacks. Sometimes I think we're so protected from real life that we forget what we're supposed to be protecting," Catherine said softly. Their eyes met across the table, and Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Here was someone who understood the burden of royal life, but hadn't let it dim her humanity. Camilla had grown cynical over the years, finding fault with public enthusiasm and rolling her eyes at what she called common sentimentality. "Would you like to see the new rose garden?" Charles asked impulsively. "Camilla designed it, but I think you'd appreciate the planning that went into it." They walked through the gardens together, their conversation flowing naturally from royal duties to personal observations. Catherine admired the careful arrangement of colors and varieties, asking thoughtful questions about the growing seasons and maintenance. "It must be wonderful to create something so beautiful," she said, touching a pale pink bloom. "To know that it will bring joy to people long after you're gone." "Camilla always said the garden was her legacy," Charles replied. "Something lasting and beautiful." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Legacy is important, but so is the present moment. These flowers are beautiful today. Right now. That matters too." As they walked back toward the castle, Charles felt lighter than he had in months. Catherine's perspective on life, on duty, on finding meaning in small moments, reminded him of feelings he thought he had lost forever. "Thank you for today," he said as they reached the entrance. Not just for the meeting, but for the conversation. Catherine smiled. Thank you for listening. It's rare to find someone who truly hears what you're saying. After she left, Charles returned to his study. The roses outside his window looked different now. Not monuments to past promises, but living things that deserved attention and care. He thought about Catherine's words regarding present moments, and wondered when he had stopped living in the now. That evening, Camilla returned from her own engagements, full of complaints about the day's events. The charity lunch had run long, the speeches were boring, and the photographers were intrusive. I don't understand why people expect us to act interested in every mundane detail of their lives, she said, settling into her chair with a tired sigh. That woman at the hospital went on and on about her grandchildren. As if I have time for such trivialities. Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. When had she become so removed from the people they were meant to serve? When had duty become mere performance for her? Perhaps she just needed someone to listen, he suggested gently. Camilla waved dismissively. Charles, darling, we can't possibly invest emotionally in every sob story we encounter. We'd be exhausted within a week. The contrast with Catherine's approach couldn't have been starker. Where Camilla saw obligations, Catherine saw opportunities. Where Camilla maintained distance, Catherine offered genuine connection. Later that night, as Camilla slept beside him, Charles stared at the ceiling and thought about the day. Catherine's laugh echoed in his memory, along with her words about living in the present moment. For the first time in years, he had felt truly alive during a royal engagement. He thought about the children Catherine had described. The little girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher. When had he last encouraged someone's dreams instead of simply fulfilling ceremonial duties? When had he last felt that his position could make a real difference in someone's life? The moonlight streamed through the bedroom windows, illuminating the room where he and Camilla had shared so many conversations about their future together. But those conversations had gradually shifted from dreams and possibilities to schedules and obligations. Romance had been replaced by routine. Charles slipped quietly from the bed and walked to the window overlooking the garden. The roses were barely visible in the darkness, but he could imagine them there, growing and blooming according to their own natural timeline, not the rigid schedule of royal life. Tomorrow, there would be another day of duties, another round of carefully orchestrated public appearances. But something had shifted inside him today. Catherine's presence had awakened something he thought was gone forever. The desire to truly connect, to make a meaningful difference, to feel genuinely engaged with life. He wondered if Catherine felt the same connection he had experienced during their time together. The way she had looked at him when discussing the children's initiative suggested that she saw something in him beyond his title and position. She saw the man who had once believed he could change the world, one conversation at a time. As dawn approached, Charles remained at the window, watching the garden slowly emerge from darkness. Today would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and perhaps new insights into what his life could become if he had the courage to embrace change. The roses in the garden began to catch the first rays of sunlight, their petals opening to greet the new day. Charles took it as a sign that growth and transformation were possible. Even after years of dormancy, the question was whether he was brave enough to step into the light and let himself bloom again. 3 weeks had passed since the garden meeting, and Charles found himself looking forward to Catherine's visits with an anticipation that troubled him. Their working relationship had deepened into something more meaningful than royal protocol typically allowed. Catherine arrived that Tuesday morning, carrying a folder of photographs from her recent school visits. Her cheeks were flushed from the autumn air, and her eyes sparkled with excitement about a breakthrough with one of the children she had mentioned before. "Remember the little girl who wanted to be a teacher?" Catherine said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "She wrote me a letter. She started a reading club for younger children in her neighborhood." Charles studied the carefully written letter Catherine handed him. The child's words were simple but powerful, describing how their conversation had given her courage to pursue her dreams. At the bottom, she had drawn a picture of herself reading to other children under a large tree. "This is extraordinary," Charles said softly. "You've changed her life." "We've changed her life," Catherine corrected. "This program wouldn't exist without your support." The pronoun hung between them, creating an intimacy that made Charles acutely aware of how formal his interactions with Camilla had become. When had he and his wife stopped being we and become two separate individuals sharing the same title? Their conversation flowed from the children's program to broader discussions about their roles as royals. Catherine spoke passionately about using their positions to create real change, not just maintain tradition. "Sometimes I feel like we're trapped in a beautiful museum," she confided. "Everyone expects us to be perfect displays of royal dignity. But what if we could be real people, doing real good?" Charles leaned back in his chair, struck by her honesty. "Camilla often says the same thing, but in a different way. She feels trapped by public expectation, too." Catherine tilted her head thoughtfully. "How so?" "She believes people expect too much from us," Charles explained. "That we should maintain appropriate distance to preserve the dignity of the crown." "But don't you think dignity comes from genuine service?" Catherine asked. "From showing people that we care about the same things they do?" Before Charles could answer, his secretary knocked and entered. "Your Majesty, the Duchess of Cornwall has arrived unexpectedly. She's waiting in the blue drawing room." Charles felt a strange mix of guilt and irritation. Camilla rarely visited his private study without advance notice. Her timing felt intrusive, though he couldn't exactly say why. "Please ask her to wait a moment," Charles said. "We're just finishing here." After the secretary left, Catherine gathered her papers. "I should go. We can continue this discussion another time." "Catherine," Charles said, standing as she prepared to leave. "Thank you for sharing that letter. It reminds me why this work matters." She paused at the door. "Charles, may I say something personal?" He nodded, his heart beating faster for reasons he didn't want to examine too closely. "I've noticed how much more animated you become when we discuss these projects," she said carefully. "You have so much passion for helping people. Don't let anyone convince you that caring deeply is a weakness." After Catherine left, Charles stood alone in his study, her words echoing in his mind. When had he started believing that emotional distance was necessary for royal effectiveness? When had he allowed Camilla's cynicism to influence his own approach to their shared responsibilities? He walked to the blue drawing room, where Camilla waited with obvious impatience. She was reading messages on her phone, her expression reflecting the familiar irritation that seemed to define her mood lately. "Darling," she said without looking up, "I've just come from the most tedious luncheon. The Committee for the Heritage Foundation is absolutely hopeless. They want to actually visit every property we're considering for grants." "That seems reasonable," Charles said, settling into the chair opposite her. Camilla finally looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Reasonable? Charles, we can't possibly traipse around the countryside inspecting every cottage and manor house. We'd be there for months, but how can we make informed decisions without seeing the properties ourselves?" "That's what reports are for," Camilla said dismissively. "Really, Charles, sometimes I think you forget that we have staff to handle these details." Charles thought about Catherine's surprise visits to schools, her insistence on seeing conditions firsthand. The contrast between his wife's approach and Catherine's couldn't have been more stark. "Perhaps seeing things ourselves would give us better perspective," he suggested. Camilla set down her phone and looked at him with genuine surprise. "This is very unlike you, Charles. You're usually quite practical about managing our time efficiently." "Maybe I've been too practical," he said quietly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of tea service. As they sat in comfortable silence, Charles observed his wife with new eyes. When had she stopped being curious about the world beyond royal circles? When had duty become mere obligation for her? Camilla spoke about her upcoming engagements with the mechanical precision of someone reciting a grocery list. Hospital openings, charity galas, ceremonial functions. Each event was described in terms of logistics and social requirements, rather than the potential impact on people's lives. "The children's hospital visit next week will be particularly challenging," she said. "The staff always expects us to spend individual time with the patients, which is emotionally exhausting." Charles thought about Catherine's description of visiting sick children. how she spoke about each interaction as a privilege rather than a burden. Perhaps the children benefit from those personal moments, he suggested. Of course they do, Camilla replied. But we can't save every child, Charles. We can't solve every problem. Sometimes I think people expect miracles from us simply because we have titles. Maybe they just need to know someone cares, Charles said, remembering Catherine's words about the grandmother at the hospital. Camilla studied him with growing concern. You've been quite philosophical lately. Is everything all right? Charles considered telling her about his conversations with Catherine, about the renewed sense of purpose he felt when engaging genuinely with their charitable work. But something held him back. He sensed that Camilla would dismiss these feelings as naive sentimentality. Instead, he changed the subject to upcoming official duties. They discussed schedules and protocols with their usual efficiency. But Charles felt increasingly disconnected from the conversation. His mind wandered to Catherine's projects, to the children whose lives they were actually changing. That evening, Charles and Camilla attended a formal dinner for foreign dignitaries. As they moved through the receiving line, Charles watched his wife perform her role with practiced perfection. She smiled appropriately, asked polite questions, and maintained exactly the right balance of warmth and dignity. But he found himself wondering what Catherine would ask these visitors. Would she inquire about their country's educational systems? Would she share stories about British children to create genuine connections? During dinner, Charles sat between the ambassador of Sweden and a prominent businessman. The conversation ranged from trade relations to environmental policies. Charles found himself asking deeper questions than usual, genuinely curious about their perspectives rather than simply fulfilling social obligations. Your Majesty shows remarkable insight into youth employment challenges, the ambassador observed. Have you spent much time working directly with young people in disadvantaged areas? Charles thought about the programs Catherine had described, the children she had met, the lives they were touching through their joint initiatives. My colleagues and I have been developing some innovative approaches, he said carefully. The key is listening to the young people themselves, rather than assuming we know what they need. Across the table, Camilla caught his eye and smiled approvingly. She assumed he was making appropriate diplomatic conversation. She didn't realize that his words came from genuine conviction rather than royal training. Later, as they prepared for bed, Camilla commented on his performance at dinner. You were particularly engaging tonight, she said, removing her jewelry. The ambassador was quite impressed with your knowledge of social issues. I've been learning a great deal lately, Charles replied truthfully. From whom? Camilla asked casually. But Charles detected a note of curiosity in her voice. He hesitated. Various sources. Reports. Meetings with charitable organizations. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. His real education had come from hours of conversation with Catherine, from seeing royal duty through her passionate, engaged perspective. As Camilla continued her nightly routine, Charles stood at the bedroom window overlooking the garden. The roses were no longer blooming, their season passed, but somehow the garden still held beauty in its autumn transformation. He thought about seasons of change, about relationships that evolved and sometimes grew apart. His marriage to Camilla had settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared duties and mutual respect, but passion and genuine connection had faded over the years. With Catherine, he felt alive again. Not because she was younger or more attractive than his wife, but because she reminded him of the person he used to be, the man who believed royal service could make a meaningful difference in ordinary people's lives. The question that kept him awake that night was whether it was possible to rediscover that passionate engagement within his marriage to Camilla, or whether some changes were irreversible. Could he share his renewed sense of purpose with his wife, or would she see it as a threat to the careful balance they had established? As dawn approached, Charles remained at the window, watching the garden prepare for winter's dormancy. He wondered if this season of his life was ending too, making way for something entirely new and uncertain. The morning light revealed frost on the empty rose beds, beautiful in its own stark way. Change, Charles realized, didn't always mean loss. Sometimes it meant the courage to let go of what was comfortable in order to discover what was possible. The confrontation Charles had been dreading came on a cold December morning. Camilla stormed into his study without knocking, her face flushed with anger, and her hands trembling with emotion he rarely saw her display. "I know about your meetings with Catherine," she said without preamble, her voice sharp and hurt. "The extended conversations, the private consultations, the way you light up when discussing her projects." Charles set down his pen and looked at his wife standing before him, realizing that this moment had been inevitable. The distance between them had grown too wide to ignore, and Catherine's presence in his life had only highlighted what was missing in their marriage. "Sit down, Camilla," he said gently. "We need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" Camilla's laugh was bitter. "You've been distant for months, Charles. I assumed it was the usual pressures of your position. But yesterday, I realized the truth." She pulled a chair close to his desk, her movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "Lord Harrison mentioned seeing you and Catherine together in the rose garden, deep in conversation. He said you looked happier than he'd seen you in years." Charles felt heat rise in his cheeks. He hadn't realized their meetings had been noticed by others. But of course they would be. Nothing in royal life went unobserved. "Catherine and I work well together," he said carefully. "She brings fresh perspective to our charitable initiatives." "Fresh perspective," Camilla repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Camilla, please. This isn't what you think, isn't it?" She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Tell me, Charles, when did you stop looking at me the way you look at her? When did my opinions stop mattering to you?" The question hit Charles like a physical blow because he couldn't answer it honestly without causing more pain. The truth was that Catherine's passion for their work had awakened feelings he thought he'd lost forever. Not romantic love, exactly, but something deeper. A connection of purpose, of shared vision, of genuine understanding. "You've changed," he said finally. "We both have. When did we stop caring about making a real difference in people's lives?" Camilla's anger faltered, replaced by something that looked like genuine hurt. "I never stopped caring. I just learned to protect myself from caring too much. Do you know what it's like to visit terminally ill children week after week? To comfort grieving families? To smile and offer hope when you know there isn't any?" Her voice broke slightly, revealing vulnerability Charles hadn't seen in years. "I built walls to survive this role, Charles. I thought you understood that. But those walls keep out the good along with the bad," Charles said softly. "When did we stop seeing the children we actually help? When did we stop celebrating the success stories? When did you start comparing me to Catherine?" Camilla shot back. "Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? She's everything I'm not anymore. Young, optimistic, full of naive enthusiasm for saving the world." Charles stood and walked to the window, unable to meet his wife's penetrating gaze. Below, gardeners were preparing the rose beds for winter, carefully tending each plant despite the approaching dormant season. "It's not about youth or enthusiasm," he said. "It's about remembering why we do this work. Catherine reminds me that our position is a privilege, not a burden, and I remind you that it's both," Camilla said, rising to join him at the window. "I've been your partner through scandals, through criticism, through years of learning to navigate this impossible role. I've earned the right to occasional cynicism." They stood side by side, looking out at the winter garden, and Charles felt the weight of their shared history. Camilla was right. She had stood by him through difficult times, had sacrificed her own preferences to support his vision of modernizing the monarchy. Her protective cynicism had developed as armor against a world that often seemed hostile to their efforts. "I don't want to lose what we've built together," Charles said finally. "But I can't ignore what I've rediscovered about myself through working with Catherine." "Which is what, exactly?" Camilla's voice was quieter now, less accusatory. "That I still believe we can make a meaningful difference," Charles said. "That royal service doesn't have to be performance. That we can be real people, doing real good." Camilla was silent for a long moment. "And you don't think I believe that anymore?" "I think you've forgotten how to show it," Charles said honestly. "When did we stop talking about our dreams for what the monarchy could become? When did we start going through the motions instead of genuinely engaging?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Charles realized that his growing connection with Catherine had forced him to confront problems in his marriage that had been developing for years. "Perhaps," Camilla said slowly, "we've been protecting ourselves from disappointment for so long that we forgot what hope feels like." Charles turned to face his wife fully. "Can we find our way back to hope together?" Camilla's expression was complex, mixing hurt, anger, and something that might have been longing. "I don't know. Can you work with Catherine without falling in love with what she represents?" The direct question forced Charles to confront feelings he had been avoiding. His connection with Catherine wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was deeply emotional. She had awakened parts of his personality that had been dormant for years. "I can't promise that working with Catherine won't change me," he said carefully. "But I can promise that any changes will make me a better person and a better king." "And a better husband?" Camilla asked. Charles considered the question seriously. "I hope so. If I'm more passionate about our work, more engaged with our purpose, more alive to possibilities, wouldn't that benefit our marriage too?" Camilla walked to the chair where Catherine usually sat during their meetings. She ran her hand along the armrest, as if trying to understand what magic happened in this space. "Tell me about these projects that excite you so much," she said finally. "Help me understand what you and Catherine have discovered together." For the next hour, Charles shared everything. He talked about the children's reading programs, the mental health initiatives, the innovative approaches to royal engagement that Catherine had pioneered. He described the letters from grateful families, the measurable improvements in young people's lives, the genuine connections they had forged with communities. As he spoke, he watched Camilla's expression shift from suspicion to interest to something approaching excitement. "The hospital visits," she said suddenly. "You're suggesting we spend more time with individual patients instead of just touring facilities?" "Catherine believes that 15 minutes of genuine attention can change a child's entire outlook," Charles explained. "She has stories that would break your heart and rebuild it stronger." Camilla was quiet for several minutes, processing what she had heard. "And she's documented the impact? Measured the outcomes? Meticulously. She approaches charity work like a scientist, testing hypotheses about what actually helps people." "That's actually quite brilliant," Camilla admitted reluctantly. "I've always assumed that measurement would reduce our work to mere statistics." "Catherine sees it as proof that what we do matters," Charles said. "Evidence that royal service can create lasting change." As the afternoon light faded, Charles and Camilla talked more openly than they had in months. Not about schedules or obligations, but about dreams and possibilities, about what their partnership could become if they both committed to rediscovering their shared purpose. "I want to meet with Catherine," Camilla said finally. "Not as competition but as colleagues. If she can teach me to see our work through her eyes, perhaps I can remember why I once loved this role." Charles felt a surge of hope, mixed with apprehension. "Are you sure? It might be difficult at first." "Difficult things are often worth doing," Camilla said, echoing words she had spoken years ago when they first married. "Besides, I refuse to let anyone outshine me in my own field of expertise." The comment was so typically Camilla that Charles laughed, breaking the tension that had filled the room all day. His wife's competitive spirit had been one of the qualities that first attracted him to her. Perhaps it could be the key to rebuilding their partnership. "There's one condition," Camilla continued. "These meetings include all three of us. No more private consultations that exclude me." Charles nodded. "Of course. We're a team, Camilla. We always have been." As evening fell, Charles and Camilla walked through the winter garden together. The bare rose bushes looked stark but not lifeless. They were simply waiting for the right season to bloom again. "Do you think we can make this work?" Camilla asked, slipping her arm through his. "I think we have to try," Charles replied. "For our marriage, for our work, and for all the people counting on us to be our best selves." The path forward wouldn't be easy. Integrating Catherine into their partnership, while rebuilding intimacy in their marriage, would require careful navigation. But for the first time in months, Charles felt that he and Camilla were facing the same direction, working toward shared goals. 3 days later, Catherine arrived for their first joint meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as the three of them settled around Charles's table, but it was productive tension, the kind that precedes breakthrough rather than breakdown. "Catherine," Camilla said formally, "I understand you have some innovative ideas about royal engagement. I'd like to hear them." As Catherine began to speak, her passion evident in every word, Charles watched his wife's face transform. The cynical mask slipped away, revealing the woman who had once dreamed of changing the world through royal service. Perhaps, Charles thought, the greatest gift Catherine had given him wasn't a renewal of purpose, but the courage to fight for his marriage instead of simply accepting its decline. Sometimes the most radical change was choosing to heal what was broken rather than abandoning it for something new. The winter garden outside might be dormant, but inside that warm room, 3 people committed to service were planting seeds for a remarkable spring.